Hello and welcome back to the NBA Legacy Podcast. We're finally done with the 2011 NBA Finals series. I really enjoyed that, but now it's time to move on to a different subject. And as you can see by the title, today I want to talk about Len Bias. One of the great what-ifs in NBA history. Len Bias was born on November 13th in 1963, and he would die on June 19th, 1986. One thing I realized that throughout the 2011 NBA Finals episodes, I never introduced myself. My name is Andrew. I'm originally from Missouri, but I now live in Oregon. And I was born on June 19th, 1986. I was actually born at about 9:30 in the morning Central Standard Time, roughly about 20 minutes before Len Bias would be pronounced dead from a cocaine overdose. In case any of you out there were believers in reincarnation, if somebody got Len Bias's basketball talents that morning, it definitely was not me. But it's always given me this kind of odd connection to the guy that literally the hour I was born, he was dying. Now, Len Bias isn't the only story of a potentially great basketball player that ends in tragedy, but he might be the most consequential. As many of you know listening to this podcast, Len Bias would be the second pick of the draft in 1986. And he was selected by the team that had just won the NBA Finals, the Boston Celtics, after they had just beaten Houston Rockets in the NBA Finals. And according to many people in their front office, even though Boston had the number 2 pick, they had scouted Bias as the best player in the entire draft. So you have a team in Boston that's coming off winning a championship, and it wasn't just a normal championship. There's a lot of people throughout basketball discourse and throughout the years that have argued that the 1986 Boston Celtics were the best team of all time. David Stern, at one point, I believe, said he thought that they were the best team that had been in his era since 1984 on. So to add the number 2 pick in the draft to that team would have been almost like adding, say, like Luka Doncic to the Warriors after they'd won the 2018 title. It's never really happened in NBA history that the team that good has had also a lottery pick that high. So the reason Boston had the pick, though, was because they'd made a trade back in 1984 with the Seattle Supersonics. Some of you that are a little bit younger probably remember Gerald Henderson Jr., who played for mainly the Charlotte Bobcats over his career. But his father, Gerald Henderson Sr., had played for Boston on their 1984 title team. He was a starter in the backcourt along with Dennis Johnson on the team that beat the Lakers in 7 games to win the title that year. Coming into that following season after winning the title, Henderson and Boston would struggle to come to terms on a contract, and it would result in eventually Boston sending Henderson to Seattle for a package that would include the pick that would ultimately be the second in the 1986 draft that would give them Len Bias. Now, back in 1986, there wasn't a lottery system like we have now where teams had a percentage chance based on their record, and it was drawn by a series of numbers off ping pong balls. Back in 1986, you had what was known as the envelope lottery. The previous year to this, in 1985, by having sealed envelopes with team names inside, and the pick was then chosen at random. At least in theory, right? As long as they aren't frozen. I actually don't believe Patrick Ewing and the frozen envelope theory, but you can't talk about this and not mention that. That previous season when Boston had won the title, Seattle had finished with a 31-51 record and had the 6th worst record throughout the season. Obviously, Gerald Henderson didn't swing the fortunes for the Seattle Supersonics. The biggest contribution I think this trade actually ends up making is that Henderson plays 2 full seasons for the Sonics before being traded again to the Knicks for a package that would include the pick that Seattle would eventually use and then trade to the Chicago Bulls. The player picked at the end of it that eventually went to Chicago, well, that was Scottie Pippen. Bias would be drafted number 2 by Boston, but number 1 would actually be Brad Daugherty, a center who would go to Cleveland. But there were other picks in this draft that were actually kind of interesting to look back on. Ron Harper went number 8 to Cleveland. Arvydas Sabonis went number 24 to Portland. Mark Price, number 25 to Dallas. And what was then the second round, because we had less teams at that point, Dennis Rodman went number 27 to Detroit. Fantastic pick. Nate McMillan went 30 to Portland. And Drazen Petrovic went number 60 to Portland in what was the third round at that point. Back when the NBA didn't just have the 2 rounds. Really would have been a hell of a draft for Portland if it wasn't for the Soviet Union. Might have to cover that someday on the pod. We missed out on a lot of spectacular basketball players because of the geopolitical issues at the time. But today we're here to talk about Len Bias. Len Bias wasn't really highly recruited coming out of high school. He went to Northwestern High in Hyattsville, Maryland, but was seen as a very raw talent that had great physical attributes but didn't have a whole lot of skill. So he ended up staying home and going to the University of Maryland for college. This was also a different era for basketball in college, where you didn't often have players that would go super far away from where they went to high school to go to college. You would never really see a talent often start. Now, back in this era, though, college basketball was a lot different. This was far from the era of the one and done, where a guy comes in that's highly touted from high school and is treated as a star from the minute go. Back in this era, in the early 80s, players had to really earn their stripes and earn a starting spot. It was actually pretty rare for a freshman to come in and start right away. And Bias doesn't start much of his first year at Maryland. His first year stats, I mean, you look back at him, they're actually only 7 points a game, 4 rebounds, 48% from the field. He would play 22 minutes a game. By the end of his first year at Maryland, he would end up starting 13 of the 30 games he would play in, but definitely a slow burn in terms of development for Bias. He is very raw his first year. Maryland would go 20-10 his freshman year in college, and would actually win their first round matchup against Chattanooga, but would fall in the second round to Hakeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler and their Houston college team. Now, while Houston would go on to win 60-50, Bias actually matches Hakeem Olajuwon's production in the game pretty closely. Hakeem shoots 6 for 10 from the field, has 12 points and 6 rebounds, while Bias shoots 7 of 10 from the field for 14 points and has 7 rebounds himself. So at this point, he's starting to match up with better talents and have actually higher production than what his season averages would have suggested. But earlier in the year, on February 16th, Maryland would actually upset the North Carolina Tar Heels 106-94. Now, I bring this up because one of the big conversations about Bias is always about how he measured up to Michael Jordan. The idea that if Bias had lived and hadn't died of a cocaine overdose, that Len Bias would have been Michael Jordan's rival in the 90s. So it's interesting to go back and look at some of the games the two played against each other. And in this particular game, Bias still wasn't a starter yet, but when he does check in, he does make a pretty nice impact early on. He actually guards Michael Jordan at times. Does a nice job. He has length on Jordan, which actually, you can see it bothers Jordan a little bit to have a quicker, longer defender on him. But even in this game where Jordan is a pretty sloppy and careless with the basketball, he's still the best player on the floor. It's not that close. Bias will come alive in the second half a bit. One of the more memorable shots you see from when people talk about this and they show the Bias clips, there's a jump shot in the second half where Jordan fouls Bias at about the top of the key, and Bias banks in the shot after the foul. He misses the free throw to be able to make it a 3-point play, but it's often seen as this moment of like, see, here was Len Bias making a shot over Jordan, and Jordan couldn't contest. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Len Bias, even in his freshman season, has a beautiful jump shot. He has really great form. The release is a little slow. You probably would see that as getting sped up in the NBA, but it's beautiful form, and he gets a lot of height off his jump. And it's the biggest indicator that Len Bias would have been successful if he had been able to make it to the NBA. That jump shot it's very pure, and it's hard to believe that wouldn't have translated to the professional game. It's really hard to block for anybody, no matter what level you're playing at. At this point, though, other than a few highlights and some nice defensive plays, Bias isn't super involved in the offense for Maryland yet. You can see his potential at this point, but when you go back and watch some of these games, the player to watch is really still Michael Jordan. Even this early on this North Carolina team that didn't feature him the way the Chicago Bulls would, Jordan is still the best player on the floor. The following year, though, for Bias, he would be promoted to the starting lineup and would start 31 of 32 games for Maryland. You would see his production jump up with his starting spot, playing 34.5 minutes per game, 15.3 points, still 4.5 rebounds, not doing great on the boards, but definitely making the most of more opportunities. And Maryland would improve to 24-8, but would still lose again in the second round to Illinois, 72-70. Bias had 16 points and 8 rebounds in the deciding game, and he looks much less passive than he did in his first season, and much more confident. So, one thing I think it's important to talk about, Bias will play all 4 years at Maryland, which I'll get into the next couple years in a second, but it's something that maybe we ought to think about a little bit more with how we evaluate talent now. At this point, Len Bias is in his second year in college and giving pretty good production. 15 points and basically 5 rebounds a game. That's really solid, but that's not going to blow anybody away. If he were to come into college now, not come out of for the NBA in his first year, be in his second year, only giving solid production, people would say either he's not a lottery pick or he's just a disappointment. And it's just simply taking him time to grow. And I think we don't give that enough now. One of the most amazing things to me is how much we expect these kids who are 19 years old to be good automatically. If you're not good early on, we almost give up on you. If you come in the league and within 18 months you haven't at least looked like some sort of all-star, we give up on you. As a basketball fandom, and the press does the same thing. ESPN, The Ringer, Sports Illustrated, whoever you want to say, all of us are guilty of this. And it's interesting to look back on Len Bias and see a guy who has unlimited potential, and when he comes out of the draft, looks like a world beater. Somebody that today we would be criticizing for not being good enough soon enough. A lot of Bias's lack of production, I guess you could say, had to do with the fact he did have 2 players on his team that would eventually become NBA players that took up a lot of the focus on offense. Ben Coleman and Adrian Branch, both guys that had been there before Bias and were more involved in the offense. Ben Coleman, a low post player, and Adrian Branch was a little bit more of a shooter. Neither would do much in the NBA. Adrian Branch would actually win a ring as a rookie on the 1987 Lakers that beat the team Bias would have been on in the NBA Finals, the Boston Celtics. So this is the final year, though, that Bias and Michael Jordan could match up, seeing as Michael Jordan obviously goes to the NBA in the 1984 draft, and this is the second year for Len Bias. In the end, Bias would only get that one win in his freshman season against Jordan and the Tar Heels, ultimately leaving his record against them at 3-1, at 1 win and 3 losses. Although the last matchup between the two would be on February 19th in 1984, North Carolina would win 78-63. At this point, North Carolina was easily the better and more talented team. 6 of the players on the roster that year in North Carolina would go to the NBA. At this point, though, in the last game, though, Kenny Smith, that Kenny Smith from inside the NBA, was out with a broken wrist. Even then, when you look at the two teams, the talent disparity was pretty stark. Although this game is all about Michael Jordan, he would have 25 points for the game. And not to beat a dead horse, but man, Portland really should have known that Michael Jordan was the right pick over Sam Bowie. It's easy for people to now say that, well, they had Clyde Drexler, and he was a shooting guard, so you couldn't draft another one of Michael Jordan, and no one knew Michael Jordan was going to be as good as he was. And while that's true, nobody thought Michael Jordan was going to be, arguably the greatest basketball player of all time coming out of college. But it was obvious, anyone watching this, that, let's be honest, okay, the college game back at this point was awful. There was no three-point line, and you had a 45-second shot clock. So you could watch these games and see that if you take Michael Jordan and put him in an NBA game with more opportunities and be more of a focus of the offense, that he was going to be an amazing basketball player. Like I said, I know it's beating a dead horse, but it is so stark when you go back and watch some of these older games and just how much of a talent he was even at that point. But in this game, he does pick up 2 early fouls, so he's limited in the first half. But in the second half, he scores 19 points and completely decides the game. Once again, the best player on the floor. Bias himself would end up having a pretty unremarkable game. And I think there's kind of this narrative that Bias was this equal to Jordan, even in college, and it definitely is not true. Bias may have become that in the NBA, but in their college matchups, Michael Jordan is far and away the best player on the floor, and it's not that close. Bias, the next season in 1985, would start 37 of 37 games and see his production jump up even again. 19 points per game and 7 rebounds, roughly. Bias was then taking 15 shots per game, which was up from 12 the previous year and 6 in his freshman season. Maryland would maintain a good record at 25-12 for Bias's third year, when would make it actually to the third round and lose to Villanova 46-43. That would be as far as Bias would ever go in the NCAA tournament. In the deciding game, Bias would have a pretty rough performance. 4 of 13, 8 points and 5 rebounds. But he played really well actually in the first 2 games of the tournament for Maryland. 25 points in a win over Ron Harper and the Miami, Ohio Redhawks, and a 20-point performance against David Robinson and the Navy team. So once again, like he was against Hakeem in his first season, he is matching up well against people that we know go on to be stars in the NBA. And in his 4th and final year at Maryland, you would see his production go up once again. 23 points a game, 7 rebounds. But with some of the talent on the team leading to the NBA, Maryland would fall to a record of 19-14 this final year. Although they would once again make the second round, but would lose to Nevada, Las Vegas, 70-64. Bias would actually almost score half of Maryland's points for the game. He'd have 31 and then add 12 rebounds. At this point, no one would have any idea, but this would be the last game Len Bias would ever play. He'd also had a really dominant first-round game against Pepperdine, 26 points and 8 rebounds. And you could see he was becoming much more of the offensive focus and had to lead his team more so than any of the previous 3 years he'd been there at Maryland. And this is really, if you're going to go back on YouTube and watch games of Bias, this is the year I recommend doing it. I think this is the closest it comes to seeing what he might have been in the NBA. You see him get more opportunities, be more aggressive offensively, look for his own shot in a way that a lot of times when you go back and you watch him on his first few years, he's standing off in the corner letting everybody else do things, and he picks his spots and gets his points kind of off garbage plays or maybe making an occasional cut. In this last season, you really start seeing Bias take more of a superstar level load. And one of the things that I think probably boded well, I mentioned his jump shot earlier. Every year in college, his free throw percentage went up, ending up the last year in the 80s. That's always one of the things we look at now when we look at draft prospects and the idea of if they'd be able to shoot at the higher level in the NBA. How does their free throw percentage look? And not only does his jump shot look super pure and it goes in, when you watch it, it's not a shot that you look at and go, well, looks good, but it never goes. His shot, he makes his shots. And at this point, to have a small forward, maybe power forward, probably small forward at that point in the NBA, but maybe more of a four nowadays, that was able to shoot at least long twos. I don't think you'd have seen him take a lot of threes in the NBA, but at that point in the game. But I think he definitely would have been kind of a mid-range shooter, and there wasn't a lot of guys at those positions at his size that had that jump shot and the ability to shoot, and I think it would have transferred to the NBA. And after playing all 4 seasons at Maryland, Bias would declare for the NBA draft, obviously. I did say earlier that Brad Daugherty had went number 1 for the Cavs, and that may have to do with more how people saw the game at the time. You would always take the center. If you had 2 guys, one was a wing and one was a center, and both guys were kind of equal talent level, almost always did you see teams at this point take a center. Daugherty had played 4 years at North Carolina, and on his final year had averaged 20 points and 9 rebounds, almost being a 2010 guy. And I think he's actually fallen through the cracks a little bit of NBA history. Daugherty had a really solid career for Cleveland. He averaged 20 and 10 for 3 seasons, and ultimately would retire early due to back issues that had limited him going into the mid-90s. While considering what ultimately happens with Bias, obviously you wouldn't take Len Bias number 1 in the draft knowing if he was going to die. But looking back at the talent level, I think that Bias probably should have been the number 1 pick in this draft. Actually, if you were to redo it, Dennis Rodman probably goes number 1. But looking at the top talent that was available, Len Bias had a better final season at Maryland than Brad Daugherty had for North Carolina. Bias was a more athletic player than Daugherty, and he had a much higher ceiling. There was much more of a chance that Bias was going to be a star than Daugherty. Daugherty looked like what he was going to become, which was a really solid center, pretty much close to an all-star, but not somebody. He was not the next Hakeem Olajuwon or Kareem or even Patrick Ewing. Bias had a chance to be special, and I think we look at the way we look at the draft today, Bias would absolutely have went number 1, and it may not have been that close. But in reality, Bias would go number 2 to Boston on the 17th of June, was the day of the draft, and 2 days later he would be dead. After the draft, Bias went back to the University of Maryland and partied that night with some friends until the early morning hours. At some point, Bias did some level of cocaine that when he was talking to another one of the students there, he apparently just collapsed. And they would take him to the hospital, and he was pronounced dead at 8:50 a.m. There's a lot more to this story that you can look up online. I don't want to get into that here. This is supposed to be more about basketball, and I don't want to really get into the nitty-gritty of something kind of so dark. Needless to say, though, I think we really have undersold the level of cocaine use that you saw in basketball in the 70s and 80s. Something that maybe instead of doing a 10-part retrospective on Michael Jordan and the Bulls, we could have done something where we shine the light on something that was lesser known and a story that should be told. But I'm not running ESPN, what can I say? So maybe to shift over back to the basketball stuff and set aside the tragedy of his death. One of the things we always talk about when it comes to Len Bias are the what ifs his death creates. I think the place I have to start at are the Jordan comparisons. Anytime you see Michael Wilbon on TV, talking about Len Bias, he will say all the time that Len Bias was the closest to Michael Jordan that he saw in college of that era. That he was going to be the Bird to Jordan's Magic. And I just can't quite get there. I said before the college game was awful, and that Bias was never really properly featured in the offense, maybe until his last season at Maryland. And as intriguing of a jump shot as he had, I'm not sure Bias was ever going to become good enough to become the best player on a title team. Something Jordan obviously became. Len Bias probably ends up settling more of some kind of version of, say, a Dominique Wilkins or a James Worthy. Maybe a little similar if you're looking at today's players. Maybe a little bit somebody like Anthony Davis with a dash of Scottie Pippen thrown in. Now that's a Hall of Fame player for sure. But it falls a bit short of being a player that you can say challenges Michael Jordan for supremacy in the 1990s. I think the more interesting question is what happens to the Boston Celtics if Bias doesn't die. In 1987, the year after drafting Bias, Boston would win 59 games and come out of the East, but they would lose in the NBA Finals in 6 games to the Los Angeles Lakers. Now, for the 87 Celtics, you have to remember they have what many consider the greatest front court of all time in Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish. So, Bias isn't going to take the starting job from either Bird or Kevin McHale. So he's going to come off the bench, for sure. You've got 2 Hall of Famers in his way. He's not starting his rookie year. No way. Now, in an interview years ago with Bill Simmons, Larry Bird said that if Bias had lived, he would have retired in 1988. He'd been dealing with ankle problems. He would go on to deal with back issues. Anybody that watched the 1982 Dream Team, one of the dirty secrets of that team, and everybody lists all the great talent, people forget that Larry Bird was pretty much done at that point. So it's certainly possible that if Len Bias had been drafted and looked to be good, that Bird would have felt comfortable. And if he did, there's a chance that in this alternate universe, that actually Len Bias only plays 1 year with Larry Bird. So the biggest ripple this causes in that 1987 season is what happens with Kevin McHale and his broken foot. Kevin McHale broke his foot in March of 87 in a game against Sacramento, but would keep playing throughout the playoffs in an attempt to try to repeat as champions for Boston. He still limps to this day from this broken foot and playing on it. So it can go one of two ways. You can say, if Bias is on the team, does Kevin McHale not break his foot? But that's... who knows what... I mean, does the substitution pattern change to where Kevin McHale is not on the floor at that point? No, I'm not... I will say this. Say Kevin McHale breaks his foot, okay? He still breaks his foot in this alternate timeline where Len Bias is on the team. At that point, if Len Bias is even good for a rookie, does Kevin McHale then agree to sit down and not play in those playoffs and injure his foot for the rest of his life? So the series that this actually, I think, probably weighs on the most isn't the NBA Finals that year. If Kevin McHale is not playing throughout the playoffs, even assuming Boston gets to this series, how does it affect the Eastern Conference Finals against the Detroit Pistons? In reality, Boston defeated Detroit in 7 games, but it was a really super tight series. This is the series where Bird had to make the miracle steal from the Isaiah Thomas inbound that he passes off the DJ for the lay-in, right? At that point, if Isaiah Thomas makes the pass inbounds and Detroit makes their free throws, Detroit goes back to Detroit, up 3-2 with a chance to close out Boston at home and go to the NBA Finals. In that conference finals, though, Kevin McHale averaged 19 points, 8 rebounds on 63% shooting on a broken foot. It's pretty unrealistic to expect Len Bias to match that kind of production as a rookie. I mean, with McHale out, if he's sitting out with a broken foot, you're asking a rookie Len Bias to battle with Bill Laimbeer and Rick Mahorn in the paint and be productive in a series that is already really tight to begin with. So, if Kevin McHale sits out with Len Bias being able to replace him, we very well might have gotten Detroit and Los Angeles a year earlier than we actually did, and who knows how much that changes. That 87 Lakers team was probably a better team than the one that only squeaked out a 7-game series against the Pistons the next year in 1988. But who knows what happens to the Pistons if they get to the finals, say in 87, not 88, lose? Do they make the trade that gets them Mark Aguirre? Do they end up not making the finals again, and does that change Jordan's whole trajectory? This is why Len Bias is such a touchstone and turning point in NBA history. And it may only have actually been one season that he might have been on this super team. And we'll never know, obviously, how that will have played out, but it's fascinating. So, if Larry Bird retires, and Kevin McHale doesn't destroy his foot by trying to win a title and playing on a broken foot, and if Bias is as good as I believe, right? I'm not saying he's Michael Jordan, but I'm saying he's Anthony Davis. Let's say that. Let's say he's Anthony Davis in the 1990s, maybe not quite as long, but he's that level of player like what we see today. He's a top 10 player in the league. What does that mean for Boston in the 1990s? I don't think it's as contenders like a lot of people think. In our timeline, in reality, Boston weren't really contenders after 1987 anyway. There's a lot of people that'll talk about the 1992 team. If Bird had been healthier, they might have had a shot at competing against Chicago. But in this alternate timeline, Len Bias is basically taking the Larry Bird role. Larry Bird's retired. You have Kevin McHale, who still was really good even after his broken foot. If you go back and look at his numbers, his efficiency drops after that 1987 season, but he still puts up 20 and 10 type seasons for years. Really somebody we probably need to consider when we're talking about the top 5 power forwards of all time. Kevin McHale deserves more mention than he gets. But so you have those two guys, and one of the other players that I think is interesting to talk about when we talk about the what ifs of Len Bias. In 1987, Boston would hit with the 22nd pick on drafting a guard, Reggie Lewis. Now, Lewis would average double-figure points in 5 straight seasons, and the last 2 that he would play in, he'd actually hit 20 points a game. Although he himself would die in 1993 from heart-related problems. There's some speculation on that I'm not going to get into. So let's just talk about the basketball side. If McHale doesn't make his foot worse by playing on it in 1987, and they still are able to draft Reggie Lewis, what kind of team does that leave to challenge the Chicago Bulls in the 1990s? Are they better than Patrick Ewing's Knicks? Reggie Miller's Pacers? They're not better than the Shaq Magic. That Orlando team with Shaq and Penny Hardaway was the best team in the 90s in the East after the Chicago Bulls. I don't think this Boston team is that good, but they might just be right in there with Reggie's Pacers or Ewing's Knicks. And maybe that's good enough to push Chicago to a 7th game at some point, but I don't think any of the 6 title runs, that Boston lineup beats Chicago 4 games out of 7. Maybe they end up making the NBA Finals and Jordan's playing baseball, if he even does that in this alternate timeline. I don't see these rash of championships that adding Len Bias to history really changes in terms of, at least for Boston. They probably still have the same number of championships they have now. Although you can make an argument that if Boston has Len Bias in the 1990s, they're able to stay more relevant than they did after Bird retired. And maybe that allows them to make different moves or to seem more appealing to free agents or whatever, and they don't have to wait until 2008 to become contenders again. Perhaps the biggest what if is simply whether or not Bias would have been able to overcome his drug problem. Was this something that was inevitable for him? Was he headed for this at some point and it just happened to be 2 days after he was drafted? That this would have happened, a year down the line or 2 years or however. Maybe he gets the NBA and he never dies from cocaine issues, but maybe it stunts his growth and he never reaches his potential, a la Lamar Odom. Is he that era's version of Lamar Odom? We'll never know, obviously. It's a very sad story. As I said, I feel a connection to it as it is my birthday. And the original plan was to get this episode on Len Bias out closer to June 19th, but the 2011 finals took up more time than I was expecting. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to cover next for this podcast. Probably going to do something a little less dark and tragic, which shouldn't actually be hard. But that was the story of Len Bias, a super talented wing who I think would have been a star in the NBA. I think we would have seen him be a really popular player in the 90s. The 90s were a little bit different with that, and when there was a lot of new, fresh stars that I think we look back on really fondly, I think he would have been a name we'd remember with, say, Charles Barkley and Sean Kemp and Clyde Drexler. That level of player. Probably not an A+ like a Hakeem Olajuwon or a Michael Jordan, but maybe an A-, B+ at worst. Wasn't going to be Jordan's rival. I don't think we would have looked back on this run for him if he'd lived and said, man, Jordan wanted to go play baseball, but he had to keep staying in the NBA to fight Len Bias. I don't think that would have happened. I don't think that's a change in the trajectory that Bias causes. One thing I think that was interesting was I went back and watched the film. When I watched the game he had against Navy in the NCAA tournament, as impressive as Len Bias was as a talent, David Robinson was a better prospect. He's breathtaking. I always say this when I do these podcasts, but it's a topic I want to cover at some point, blah, blah, blah. David Robinson is something I'm definitely going to cover at some point. I think he's become super underrated. I think he's become part of Tim Duncan's story more so than his own, and he was one of the Greek gods of NBA history. And I think that if we're looking at this, there's no way, even today in the NBA where you have the center position being what it is, David Robinson, you would take him coming out of Navy over Len Bias every time. And I think that kind of positioned you more where Len Bias probably would have been as a NBA player. I think along with Benji Wilson, who was a high school basketball star that died in a shooting in 1983, Bias has always been one of the darker what-ifs in NBA history. All of these what-ifs will obviously never be answered, but I think Len Bias should be remembered. And not only for the person and player he was, but also as a cautionary tale to all the players that have come since and have still yet to come. That we always forget these players are people, and all people have their faults and problems. Okay, so that's it for this episode. I'm not doing a big, long 4-part series on Len Bias. I wanted to knock this out in one episode and talk about it a little bit, considering it's pretty close to the anniversary of his passing. As I said, I'm still not sure what the next episode's going to be about, but I hope to get it out in a little bit of a sooner time frame than this one was. My goal is getting an episode out every 2-ish weeks, and I went a little bit longer this time, had some life issues happen, have an old back issue that I had to deal with. I appreciate those of you that have already started listening to the podcast. giving me patience, even though it's early on. We're already past 1,000 listens at this point, which may not sound like a lot, but it's a lot more than I was expecting to have just starting out as a podcast. So if you are listening to this, you can support the show at patreon.com/NBA Legacy Podcast. And you can follow me on Twitter at NBA Legacy Pod. I'm pretty active on there. Would love any discussion you guys want to send to me. And until next time.